He said it the way a man reads a shipping manifest, flat, factual, done. You are adequate for the purpose. That was always the understanding. Edith Bramwell did not set down her fork. She did not look up from her plate. She finished cutting her portion of lamb with the same careful precision she had used every morning for 3 years at this table, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised even herself, that those were the last words she intended to hear from her husband in this house. The morning had begun the way most mornings in the Bramwell household began, with his mother finding something to audit. Edith had been at the sideboard arranging the breakfast things when Millicent Bramwell appeared in the doorway in her gray dress, carrying the particular expression she reserved for occasions when she had already decided the verdict before surveying the evidence. The preserves are not the ones I ordered from Whitmore's. Millicent set down her gloves on the table with a small considered sound. I specified the damson. These are plum. They're from the same supplier. Edith did not turn around. Mrs. Fenwick ordered what was available. I did not ask about Mrs. Fenwick. I asked about the preserves. Edith turned then, because she had learned that not turning was read as insolence, and turning was read as submission, and there was no arrangement of her body in any room of this house that Millicent Bramwell could not find something wanting in. She turned because she was tired of calculating. I'll have the correct ones sent for by Thursday, she said. Millicent looked at her the way she looked at all domestic imperfections, with the contained displeasure of a woman who considered the world a project she had not yet finished correcting. See that you do. Edith's husband, Gideon Bramwell, arrived at breakfast the way he arrived at everything, without announcement, without greeting, without any particular acknowledgement that other people occupied the same room. He sat, he poured his coffee, he opened the correspondence that had been set beside his place. He did not say good morning. He had not said good morning in some months. Edith was not certain he had ever said it with any intention behind it. The breakfast passed the way breakfasts passed. Millicent finding fault with the temperature of the eggs, Gideon reading his letters, Edith eating her bread and managing the conversation and the silence in equal measure, which was the primary occupation of her days. Then Millicent said, pleasantly, that she had spoken to Mrs. Hartley about the autumn assembly, and that perhaps this year they might reconsider who hosted the opening supper. Edith kept her eyes on her plate. The Hartleys have a larger drawing room, Millicent continued, and their table makes a better impression for the kind of guests the assembly tends to draw. This is the 3rd year we've hosted the opening supper, Edith said. This is the 3rd year we've had the same table. Millicent smoothed her napkin. I simply want the occasion done properly. It is done properly. Edith set her fork down. I have managed this household social calendar for 3 years without a single complaint from the assembly committee. Millicent smiled. It was the smile Edith had catalogued in detail over 3 years, small, tight, and carrying the precise amount of warmth required to communicate that no warmth was being offered. I'm sure you've done your best, dear. Edith breathed in. Gideon looked up from his letter. And what he said next was not delivered with cruelty. That was the thing about it. That was what made it so thorough, so complete, so impossible to argue with, on any grounds that would be recognized by the room. He said it the way he reported facts from his ledgers, calm, settled, as though explaining to someone the current price of wool. You are adequate for the purpose. That was always the understanding. He went back to his letter. The room did not react. Millicent continued eating. The clock on the mantel continued its small, indifferent marking of time. A bird moved in the garden outside the window, visible through the glass, ordinary and unaware. Edith sat exactly where she was. Her spine was straight, her hands were still. Her face, and she knew her face, had spent 3 years learning to manage it the way you manage a room, checking every corner for anything that could be used, showed nothing, but she felt it. Not the sharp pain of a word meant to wound. Something slower. Something that moved through her the way cold water moves through stone, finding the places that were already worn, following them down. He had said it without thinking. He had said it without intending to hurt her, which was worse than intention, because intention could be argued with. Intention at least acknowledged you existed enough to injure. He had simply stated what he believed. Adequate for the purpose. She had heard the purpose discussed, once, in the year before their marriage, when her father and his solicitor had sat in her father's study and sorted out the terms with the brisk efficiency of men trading commodities they both understood. Her father's mill, the one that had been in the Calder family for 40 years, carried debts her father had been managing by attrition for a decade. The Bramwell name carried capital. The arrangement was clean. Edith had been 23. She had known what the arrangement was. She had not known or perhaps had simply refused to know what it would feel like to hear it described at breakfast 3 years later, as though she were a purchase that had met its specifications. She finished her coffee. She rose from the table. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. A small, precise gesture she'd had since girlhood. The kind that her mother had once called her composing gesture. The thing she did before something difficult. "Good morning," she said to the room. To no one in particular, to the clock in the window and the untouched marmalade. She walked out of the dining room. She did not slam the door. She did not hurry on the stairs. She went to her room with the even, unhurried step of a woman who has decided something and does not need to announce it. The decision was already made, she understood. It had perhaps been made for some time in the back room of herself, where she kept things she wasn't yet ready to examine. It was simply named now. That was what this morning had done. Given the thing its name. She opened the wardrobe. She packed the way she had learned to do everything in this house. Efficiently, without waste, without sentiment interfering with practicality. 2 dresses, the brown wool and the blue muslin. Her work apron. Her mother's brooch, which had come to her when the mill had to be sold, small and silver, and the only thing she had from that life. Her notebooks, 3 of them, filled with the accounting systems she had developed for the Bramwell household, because the one she had inherited had been a quarterly disaster, and she had fixed it in her first month without being asked. Her savings. 4 years of small withdrawals from the household accounts, never more than what could be attributed to ordinary variance. Always recorded correctly in the column she kept in her own handwriting separately from the ledger she submitted to Gideon. She was, among other things, very good with numbers. A knock at the door. "Edith, come in." Her mother's older sister, Hester Calder, who had moved into the Bramwell house 2 years ago at Edith's quiet arrangement. Because Hester had no money and nowhere else to go, and because Edith had decided that if she was going to manage this household, she was going to have at least one person in it who had known her before she became adequate for a purpose. Hester stepped inside. She saw the bag on the bed. She looked at her niece. "How long have you been planning this?" It wasn't entirely a question. Edith folded her work apron. "I haven't been planning it. I've been prepared for it. There's a difference." Hester came further into the room. She was 61 years old and had survived the death of a husband, the ruin of a family business, and 2 winters in a borrowed room before Edith had found a way to bring her here. She did not fluster easily. She stood in the center of the room and watched her niece pack with the eyes of a woman assessing evidence. "Where will you go?" Edith set the notebooks in the bag. "You remember the letter I received in the spring? From Mr. Aldrin, the mill assessor from Dunmore. He wasn't assessing by then. He was writing because Dunmore has a problem that apparently no one there can sort out." She smoothed the top notebook flat. 3 of the 4 mill operations in the valley have been running on incorrect rate calculations for at least 6 years. Overpaying some suppliers, underpaying others. The dispute has been going on long enough that 2 families have stopped speaking, and one is threatening litigation. Hester stared at her. "You kept that letter." Edith looked up. "I kept all the letters that might be useful." Hester sat down on the edge of the chair by the window. She looked at the bag, looked at her niece's face. There was something moving behind her eyes. The particular complex expression of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has just been given, unexpectedly, a reason not to be. "He won't come after you," Hester said. "He'll let the arrangement sort itself out." Edith closed the bag, then let it sort. She picked up the bag. She looked once around the room she had occupied for 3 years. The room she had made livable by the incremental addition of things that were hers. The books on the left side of the shelf, the small mirror angled to catch the morning light, the correct position of the writing desk, which she had moved 6 inches to the left in her first week, because the original position made the afternoon shadow fall directly across the work surface. "Come with me to Dunmore," she said to Hester. "There's nothing here for either of us that we couldn't build better somewhere else." Hester looked at her for a long moment. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. They were out the kitchen entrance before the breakfast dishes had been cleared, carrying between them everything that mattered, which was not very much, which was itself a useful thing to know. The coaching road to Dunmore ran northeast through hill country that was neither beautiful nor particularly practical, just the ordinary landscape of a working region doing what it had always done. Sustaining people who had decided to live there. Edith watched it through the coach window and did not think about Gideon. She thought about the rate calculation problem, which was a real problem with a real solution that she could reasonably locate if given access to the original mill contracts and 6 hours of uninterrupted work. The problem occupied her for the first hour. The second hour she allowed herself to think about what she was doing, not why. She knew why. She thought about what Dunmore was, what it wasn't, what she could build there with the skills she actually had, as opposed to the skills that had been considered relevant to her purpose. Managing a household social calendar was a skill. So was managing household accounts. So was the accounting systems she'd built for the Bramwell mill suppliers. Because Gideon's factor had been using a method that compounded errors across quarters, and no one had noticed because no one had looked. She had looked. She had fixed it without being asked or credited. She had done it because problems that could be fixed were problems that should be fixed, and she had never managed to believe otherwise. Hester slept beside her with the particular sound sleep of a woman who had been not quite at rest for 2 years. Dunmore was a mill town the way all mill towns were, built around the thing that kept it alive, organized outward from the sound of machinery. Edith had been in Dunmore once, at 15, with her father, when he'd had business at the Aldrin operation. She remembered it as purposeful. She still found it so. The man who met them at the coaching office was not Webb Aldrin, who had written the letters, but his associate, a younger man named Silas, who was perhaps 25, and had the slightly desperate expression of someone who has been managing a situation beyond his authority for longer than was comfortable. "You're Mrs. Bramwell?" He said it with some uncertainty, as though he had expected someone different, someone, she suspected, who looked more like a person who sorted out mill account disputes, and less like a woman who had just arrived on a public coach with 2 bags and an aunt. "I am." She set down her bag. "I understand you have a rate calculation problem that's been running for 6 years. He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's find Mr. Aldrin, and I'll need the original contracts from all 4 operations if you have them. If you don't have them, we'll need to know who does." He found them. Webb Aldrin was 68, large-handed, deliberate in his speech, and possessed of the expression of a man who had been told help was arriving and had not entirely believed it until it was standing in his office. He looked at her for a long moment when Silas brought her in. "Mrs. Bramwell," he said. "Mr. Aldrin." She sat down across from his desk. "Tell me what you know about the problem, and then let me see the contracts. I'd rather hear it from you first before I look at the numbers, so I understand what the numbers will have to account for," he told her. It took 40 minutes. She asked 9 questions. By the end of it, she had a reasonable picture of what had gone wrong and a working theory about where the original error had been introduced. The contracts he laid out on his desk were old. 2 of them predated the current mill ownership by more than a decade. She looked at them the way she looked at all documents that were supposed to tell you something. Not for what they said on the surface, but for where they were inconsistent with themselves. She found it in an hour and a half. A unit of measurement that had been recorded one way in the original contracts and another way in the amended version from 11 years ago. A single line, quietly inconsistent, propagated through every calculation since. "One line," she said. Aldrin looked over her shoulder. "That's it? That's the origin. Everything else followed from that." She set her pencil down. "The good news is that it's correctable. I'll need to work through all 4 sets of accounts to calculate the actual amounts owed in each direction. But the methodology is straightforward once you know where the error is." He was quiet for a moment. "How long will that take?" 3 days, she said. "Perhaps 4, if the older records are poorly organized." He looked at her. "Mrs. Bramwell, I have to ask. Ask. Your husband's people know you're here?" "My husband knows I'm gone." She met his eyes. "The details are my own affair." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, slowly, in the manner of a man revising an assumption he'd been operating on. "Silas will show you the records room," he said. "There's a decent boarding house on Mill Street. Mrs. Dowd keeps it. Tell her Webb sent you." She thanked him and went to find the records. The boarding house was clean and quiet, and Mrs. Dowd, who was perhaps 50, and had the manner of a woman who had heard most things, and found very few of them worth commenting on, gave Edith and Hester 2 rooms on the 2nd floor without asking any questions Edith hadn't volunteered answers to. The first evening, Hester sat across the small table in Edith's room while Edith worked through the first set of accounts, and said, "He won't know what's wrong at first." Edith did not look up from the ledger. She knew who Hester meant. "He'll know the house is different. He won't know why." "No," Edith said. "He won't. He'll think it's Mrs. Fenwick. He'll think it's Mrs. Fenwick for at least 2 weeks. Then he'll start to find things that don't add up." Edith turned a page. "My account system isn't written down anywhere except in my notebooks, because no one asked me to write it down for someone else to use. It's in my handwriting on paper that's now in my bag." Hester was quiet for a moment. "You thought of that." "I think of most things." Edith set down her pencil and looked at the ceiling for a moment. the particular look of someone doing arithmetic in their head. I just usually think of them for other people's benefit. Hester looked at her niece. This woman she had watched grow up quiet and capable, and overlooked in approximately equal measure, who had at 23 walked into a marriage arranged around a mill debt, and managed to build inside that arrangement a life that was at least functional, and at most occasionally dignified. She had watched Edith get smaller, the way you watch a room get darker without noticing until someone opens a window. "You look different," Hester said. Edith picked up her pencil. "I feel different. Good different." She didn't answer for a moment, then, yes. She went back to the accounts. Good different. Back in the house on Calloway Street, things were not immediately catastrophic. That was the first problem. Gideon Bramwell was a man of organized habits, and the habit of not noticing things that were handled correctly, and for the first several days, enough continued to be handled correctly. By Mrs. Fenwick, by the cook, by the established rhythms of a household that had been running on Edith's systems long enough that the systems ran themselves. The second problem arrived on the third day, when the monthly supplier accounts came in, and no one could find the ledger system. Mrs. Fenwick brought the accounts to Gideon's study. She stood in front of his desk and explained, as clearly as she was able, that Mrs. Bramwell's accounting method had always been kept in Mrs. Bramwell's personal records, and that she, Mrs. Fenwick, had never needed to understand the full system, because Mrs. Bramwell had always managed the accounts directly. Gideon looked at the accounts. He looked at the column headers Mrs. Fenwick had attempted to fill in using the previous month's figures. He looked at the sum at the bottom, which did not match the sum at the bottom of the previous month's accounts, for reasons Mrs. Fenwick could not explain. He sent Mrs. Fenwick away. He sat alone in his study with the accounts in front of him and tried to trace backward through a month of household expenditures, using a system that was entirely in someone else's handwriting and that no one in the house could explain. By the end of the afternoon he had found 3 inconsistencies. By the following morning there were 5. None of them were large. All of them mattered. He wrote to his solicitor. His mother found him at his desk on the 5th evening. She came in without knocking, which was her method, and she looked at the papers spread across his desk and at the particular expression on her son's face. A man engaged with a problem he had not anticipated and was not certain he could solve. "Gideon," she said. He set down his pen. Millicent sat across from him and folded her hands. She had the composed look she wore when she was about to say something she had prepared. She had been preparing it, Gideon suspected, for several days. "She was more capable than I credited," Millicent said. He looked at her. "I found that out some time ago," she continued. "I simply did not find it relevant to say so. That is not useful to me now, Mother." "No." Millicent looked at the papers. "But it may be useful to you later." She paused. "The Assembly Committee wrote to ask about the autumn supper." He didn't respond. "I told them the arrangements were ongoing," she said. She paused. "She has been managing that relationship for 3 years. They know her. They don't know me." He picked up his pen. He set it down again. "Where is she?" he asked. Not a question he would have expected himself to ask. He had thought the first morning that the space would simply reorganize itself around her absence, that things would continue more or less as they had, adjusted slightly. He had not thought to miss the specific texture of her presence. Not warmth, exactly. He had not thought of Edith in terms of warmth. But there had been something. A quality of the house that he had attributed to the house, that he was now understanding had been attributed incorrectly. His solicitor had sent a letter to the Calder family's old address in Harwick. It had come back undelivered. She did not tell anyone where she was going, Millicent said. Which means she didn't want to be found. "I have that letter." "I know you have the letter." She looked at him with the steady attention of a woman who has been watching her son for 40 years and has arrived at a number of conclusions she hasn't shared. "I am pointing out that it's been 6 days, and the household accounts are in a state, and the assembly supper has no coordinator, and you are sitting in your study every night looking at papers you can't make sense of." He was quiet. "She told you not to look for her." "Yes." Millicent smoothed her skirt. "Are you going to?" She said not to. "That isn't an answer, Gideon." He looked at his mother. Something shifted in his face, not quite recognition, not quite discomfort. Something between the two that had no settled name. "I'll find her," he said. "Not because of the accounts." Millicent looked at him steadily. "Then why?" He picked up the pen again. He looked at it. He set it down. "Because I said something at that table that I cannot account for," he said. "And I've been unable to account for it since." Millicent was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was quieter than usual and scraped down to something that sounded almost like honesty, "What you said was beneath you. I did not correct it at the time. I should have." He looked at her. She stood. I'm going to bed, she said. The records from the Dunmore region are in your father's old files, if you're looking for where she might have gone. The Calder mill had dealings there. He stared at her. You knew, I suspected. She smoothed her dress at the threshold. She had a letter from a Webb Aldrin in March. I saw the return address. She looked at him. I'm telling you now. She walked out. He sat alone with the accounts and his mother's words and the specific quality of a house that had been managed for 3 years by someone he had described over breakfast as adequate for a purpose, and he thought, for the first time, about what that purpose had been as she had understood it. Not as he had described it, as she had lived it. He had known abstractly that the arrangement had required something of her. He had understood this the way he understood most things that did not require immediate action, noted, filed, moved past. He had not asked. It had not seemed necessary to ask because the arrangement was what it was, and she had agreed to it and everything had functioned correctly. Everything had functioned correctly. He sat with that for a long time in the dark. She had made it function correctly. That was not the same thing as it functioning. He left for Dunmore the following morning. He found the boarding house on Mill Street without particular difficulty. Small towns being what they were, and a woman with account skills, and an aunt arriving on the public coach, being the sort of information that circulated quickly in a place where everyone's business was adjacent to everyone else's. Mrs. Dowd answered the door and looked at him with the assessing calm of a woman who had seen most situations arrive at her door and had opinions about all of them. I'm looking for Mrs. Bramwell, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood aside. She's at Aldrin's this morning. Mill office, up the main street, turn right at the warehouse. He found the mill office. He heard her before. He saw her. Her voice through the open window, not loud, not performing, simply certain in the way that things are certain when the person speaking knows exactly what they're talking about. The discrepancy compounded because no one checked the unit conversion in the amended contract. She was speaking to someone he couldn't see. It was treated as a clerical correction, not a substantive one, so it bypassed the normal review. But the effect was substantive. Everything built on top of it has been wrong in the same direction. A man's voice. How long to recalculate? I've done 2 of the 4 operations. Today and tomorrow, I'll finish the others. You'll have the corrected figures by Thursday. Gideon stood outside the window for a moment he had not planned on. He had known, or he'd thought he'd known, what his wife did with her time. She managed the household. She attended to social correspondence. She arranged the things that required arranging. He had understood this the way he understood the function of any well-run system, abstractly, correctly, without particulars. He had not imagined, and this was what settled on him now with some weight, that what she was doing was this, that she had a mind that worked like this, that she could walk into someone else's tangled accounts and find the origin point in an afternoon, and be describing the solution clearly at 10 in the morning, as though it were simply the next thing. He stepped inside. She looked up from the table where she had a large ledger spread open, both elbows on the edge, one hand holding a pencil. She saw him, her face moved through something, not shock, not quite, more expression of a person whose calculations have just been updated. Mr. Bramwell, she said. Gideon, he said. He felt, saying it, slightly foolish. He had not prepared for how to begin. The man across the table was looking between them with the alert interest of someone who understood this was not their business, and had every intention of witnessing it regardless. Silas, Edith said, without looking away from Gideon. Could you give us a few minutes? Silas could. He went. The room was quiet. Outside, the sound of the mill operation ran steadily, the particular persistent rhythm of machinery doing what machinery does. You tracked me down, she said. She did not say it with accusation. She said it the way she said most things observationally, with the neutrality of someone noting a fact that will need to be processed. I went to Dunmore. That wasn't difficult to find. He looked at the ledger, at the work spread across the table, at the pencil in her hand. I've been told you found the problem. Yesterday afternoon. He nodded. What was it? She told him. She described it the same way she had described it to Webb Aldrin. Clearly, efficiently, without dumbing it down or inflating its complexity. She talked about the unit conversion, the compounding error, the direction it had propagated. He listened. He had not expected to understand it. He found, unexpectedly, that he did. Your father was a mill man, she said when she'd finished. I'd forgotten that, I hadn't. He looked at the table. He'd taught me most of what I know about the supply side. He never taught you the accounts? He hired people for that. He paused. He said a man who spent his time on the numbers had too little left for the decisions. Edith looked at him, for a moment. And you agreed with that? I didn't question it. He said it without inflection, which was the honest version of the answer. She looked at him steadily. This woman he had lived with for 3 years and had not. He was now understanding with the full uncomfortable weight of that understanding. Looked at. He had seen her. He had processed her existence in the same way he processed all the functional elements of his household, correctly, without attention. She did not look like a woman who had been managed. She looked, in the plain light of a working office in a mill town, more present than he had ever seen her. More specific. Less the shape his assumptions had assigned her, and more herself, whatever that was, whatever she actually was, which he was only now realizing he did not know. I said something at breakfast, he said. I know what you said at breakfast. I need to say it was wrong. She waited. Not wrong because I should have been more careful. He forced himself to be exact, because being exact was the one skill he had that she might respect. Wrong because it was. He stopped. Because it described a thing that was not true. You are not. He stopped again. You are not adequate for a purpose. That is not what you are. Her expression did not change. What am I then? The question landed with the weight he deserved. He had walked into it and he knew it. I don't know, he said, and I want to. That is, he looked at the ledger, at the mill office, at the evidence of what she had accomplished in 6 days in a place where no one had arranged anything for her. That is what I came to say, that I don't know, and I should know, and I have spent 3 years not asking. She looked at him for a long time. He made himself hold the look. That's not an apology, she said finally. No, it's not. An apology is for later when you've decided whether you want one. He paused. Right now it's just the truth. She picked up her pencil. She set it down. She looked at the window. I have 2 more operations to work through, she said. Thursday I'll have the full corrected figures for Mr. Aldrin. She turned back to him. I'm not leaving before I've finished. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him. There was something in the look that was not warm and was not cold, and was possibly the careful, specific assessment of a woman who has been surprised by something and is deciding what to do about it. There's a decent public house on the east side of the street, she said. Tell them Webb sent you. The lamb is reliable. He picked up his hat. He nodded. He walked out. He was at the door when he heard her, not calling after him, just continuing in the tone of someone completing a thought. Come to the Thursday meeting, when I present the findings to the 4 operations. She paused. I want you to see it. He stopped. He turned. Why? Because, she said, and she had gone back to the ledger. Pencil already moving. She didn't look up. You should see what you've been funding. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to find the public house. The Thursday meeting went the way Edith's work always went when she had done it correctly, which was to say it resolved, but not without friction on the way. One of the mill owners disputed the calculation methodology before she'd finished presenting it. Another had brought his solicitor, which required an additional 90 minutes of explanation that should not have been necessary. The 4th mill's figures were more tangled than the other 3, because someone had been doing a separate adjustment to the accounts for years without documenting the rationale, and that required 40 minutes of careful unraveling before the room could agree on the correct base number. Edith stood at the head of the table for 3 hours and managed all of it. Gideon sat at the back of the room and watched. He watched her not perform authority. He had been in enough business meetings to know the difference between a person demonstrating that they were in charge and a person who simply was. She was the latter, answering the solicitor's questions without deference or defensiveness, calmly locating the exact passage in the contract that addressed each dispute, explaining the methodology in 3 different ways until the mill owner, who'd initially objected, found the version he could follow. When it was finished, 4 men who had not agreed on anything in 6 years left the room with a corrected set of figures and a schedule for settling the amounts owed in each direction. Webb Aldrich shook her hand. Silas shook her hand. The mill owner who had disputed the methodology shook her hand last, slightly grudgingly, which she received with the contained acknowledgement of a woman who understood the grudging kind was sometimes the most honest kind. Gideon waited until the room had emptied. She was gathering her papers when he came to stand beside the table. She did not look up immediately. The methodology dispute, he said. You'd anticipated that. She set a ledger in her bag. Yes. How? She looked up. Because it was the weakest point in the presentation. Not because it was wrong. It wasn't wrong. But because it was the point where my reasoning required trusting my interpretation of an ambiguous passage rather than an unambiguous one. She closed the bag. I knew someone would find it. I prepared for it. He was quiet for a moment. That was the correct answer. He recognized it as the correct answer because it was what he would have said about his own work, in a room where he was competent. She picked up the bag. She turned to leave. Edith. She stopped. He was not. He had discovered over 3 days in Dunmore good at this. He was not good at the words that were required for situations where his usual competence, at logistics, at decisions, at the efficient resolution of problems with definable solutions, did not apply. He had been standing at the edge of this particular conversation for 3 days, and he had not found a way in that he trusted. He found one now, the way you find a way into a locked room, not with force, but by stopping trying to pick the lock and simply describing what he saw through the window. I didn't ask you, he said, when we married, what you were good at. She turned, she was listening. I didn't ask because I thought I knew. He held her gaze, and I thought I knew because I didn't look. He paused. I arranged an agreement, and I maintained it, and I told myself that was sufficient. And I did not ask, and I did not look, and I sat at that breakfast table for 3 years eating food you'd arranged, and living in a house you'd organized and using accounts you'd built, and I described you as adequate. He stopped. I described you as adequate to your face, in front of my mother, and meant it as a compliment, and did not see any of it. She was looking at him with the expression he had come to understand over 3 days was her real one. Not the composed surface she maintained, but the one underneath, careful and specific and doing its own assessment. That is still not quite an apology, she said. No. He looked at his hands. I know. He looked back at her. An apology I can give you. But this I needed you to hear first. So the apology means something when it comes. She said nothing for a moment. He waited. She had learned, she understood, to distrust words offered after damage. She had learned to look not at what people said, but at what they did with the space between saying and meaning. She had been looking for 3 days at what Gideon Bramwell did when he did not know what to do, and what he did was sit with it. He had not argued, he had not managed. He had sat at the back of a room and watched her work with the full, uncomfortable attention of a man who was revising his understanding of something he'd thought was settled. She was not ready to trust that, but she was willing to let it be what it appeared to be, and see what it became. There's a public supper at the Aldrin house on Saturday, she said. Webb invites the whole town. It's not formal. He waited. Come to supper, she said. See what this place is. She turned toward the door. See what I'm like in it. She paused with her hand on the doorframe, not looking back, just pausing. Then we'll see. That's all. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. She walked out. He stood alone in the mill office for a moment longer, in the particular silence of a room where something has been said clearly and correctly, and is now sitting in the air waiting to become whatever it was going to become. Outside, Dunmore was doing what it always did. Running, operating, making itself useful in the steady, purposeful way of a place that understood what it was for. He put on his hat. He went to find Webb Aldrin. Saturday's supper was loud and warm, and smelled of wood smoke and mutton and the particular homeliness of a room where people had been coming together for years, and had stopped noticing how comfortable it had become. Edith arrived early, because Webb had asked her to help Silas organize the table arrangements, which she had done with the efficient goodwill she brought to all problems that had obvious solutions. Gideon arrived slightly late. He appeared in the doorway in his traveling coat, and she watched him from across the room do the thing she had watched him do all week: stand, look, assess, before he moved. He was careful, she had come to understand. He was not warm the way rooms are warm, but he was not cold the way she had assumed. He was simply a person who did not move until he understood the territory, and who had spent 3 years not understanding her because he had stopped looking long before he should have. He found her across the room. He crossed to her. She handed him a plate. The lamb, she said, before Webb's cousin gets to it. He took the plate. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the beginning of one. I've been warned, he said. She turned back to the table. He was not, she discovered over the next 2 hours, incapable of conversation. At the Bramwell house, surrounded by his mother's social precision and the formal expectations of Calloway Street, he had moved through dinners like a man fulfilling an obligation. Here, without the architecture, he was simply a person at a table, and he was the kind of person, she discovered, who asked questions and listened to the answers. She saw Webb corner him near the window an hour in. She watched Webb say something, watched Gideon answer, watched Webb's expression move through assessment towards something that looked, cautiously, like approval. Webb Aldrin did not extend approval easily or without reason. She did not go over. She went on with her own conversation, with Mrs. Dowd, with Silas, with the 3 women from the smallest mill operation who wanted to ask about the rate correction timeline. But she knew, in the way she had learned to know things without looking at them directly, that Webb was asking the kind of questions that were about character rather than business. And she knew, without having to confirm it, what Gideon was doing in response. He was not performing. That was the thing. He was simply answering. An hour later, she found herself standing near the edge of the room when he came to stand beside her. They looked out at the same scene. Webb and Mrs. Dowd arguing cheerfully about something. Silas attempting to prevent Webb's cousin from monopolizing the lamb. 3 children running between the adult legs with the complete indifference to social geography that only children and very confident adults achieve. "You talked to Webb," she said. "He told me about Dunmore," Gideon said. "How it came to be what it is." He paused, I asked. She looked at him sideways. "He said a thing," Gideon continued, "that I found I agreed with. That most places that work well do so because someone decided they were going to work and didn't stop making that decision." He was quiet for a moment. He was talking about the town. I wasn't only thinking about the town. She looked back at the room. The fire was high. Someone had started singing something, badly, and 3 people were laughing at it. "You'll come back to Calloway Street," she said. "Eventually. If you come back." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her steadily, the way he had looked at the ledger Thursday, the way he had looked at the mill office window, before he'd understood what he was seeing, directly. Without the management. "Not as the arrangement, Edith." He said it quietly enough that it was only for her. "As something different. As something I'd like to be worth more to. If you'll give me the time to figure out how." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first morning, the preserves, the lamb. The word adequate delivered like a line item. She thought about her notebooks in her bag upstairs. She thought about 4 mill owners shaking her hand in a room where the problem was solved. She thought about what it meant to go back. And what it meant to go back on her own terms. "What would be different?" she said. "Not as a question, as a condition." He didn't hesitate. "The accounts would be yours, managed openly with your name on the records. The social calendar would be yours in name and in practice, not hidden behind Mrs. Bramwell's quiet arrangement. Whatever work you do, here or elsewhere for Aldrin or anyone else, stays yours. Your name on it, your time given to it, your fee if there's a fee." She listened. "My mother," he said, and he paused there on his mother, which she noted. "She and I will have a different conversation before you come back. I'll have it with her, and I'll tell you what was said, and you can decide after that whether her presence in the house is something you want to continue." Edith looked at him. "You would do that?" "Yes." She breathed in once. She thought about Hester, upstairs, who had slept soundly every night since they'd arrived. She thought about Mrs. Dowd, who had fed them soup on a Tuesday without being asked and hadn't mentioned it since. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where she was useful, openly useful, without managing the fact of it. "I'll want an office," she said. "In the house, not a sitting room. An actual office." "Yes. I'll want Hester to stay," she said. She paused. "Not in a borrowed room." He didn't argue. She looked out at the room one more time. "When I come back," she said, and she said it carefully, meaning every word. "I'll come back as myself, not as an adequate arrangement, as a person you intend to actually know." "Yes," he said. "That's the only way I'm asking." She looked at him. She found the true line, the honest bearing, the place where it held. "All right," she said. It wasn't a love story yet. She knew that. It was something more provisional than love and more honest than the arrangement that had preceded it. 2 people at the edge of something, deciding with clear eyes to try it properly this time, which was more than most people managed, and which was enough for now to begin. She picked up her empty plate. "Get more lamb," she said, "before it's gone." He went. She watched him cross the room, accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Dowd, and stood for a moment in the warm, crowded middle of Webb Aldrin's supper, in a place she had come to by her own direction, having solved the thing in front of her, having refused to be small, having demanded to be seen. She had walked out of a dining room 10 days ago knowing her own worth. She was walking back in, when she went back, as someone who had proved it, not to him, not to his mother, not to the 4 mill owners who had shaken her hand. To herself. That was the only proof that had ever mattered, and she was not going to put it down again.